Thanks to Riccardo and Bernardini for this invitation, and to Marlestine and the other organizers. The title is, my title is The Future of the Spirit in the Red Book and in Our Time. A myth may be thought of as a story that contains what a culture needs to know, as Notre says. In the Christian myth, God dies on the cross. And this, whether one likes it or not, is the myth which molded European culture for centuries. Over the last 160 years, its cultural hegemony has been going through a process of slow disintegration. However, in the Christian message, the death of God is only one episode, a moment already announced in the story of the Passion of Christ. Jung knows this well, very well, and he inserts the death of God in a symbolic archetypal repertory which places the quintessence of loss at the transition from chaos to the rebirth of a new figure of God. However, even the drama of death and resurrection does not conclude the story of the New Testament. Return to Earth, the second phase, foreshadows the ascent into heaven of the Christ figure, the third phase, and the return of the transformed God with the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. This fourth phase, however, is the beginning of a slow, tormented story, which seems likely to end with a new revelation of the union of heaven and earth, the union of God with a liberate humankind, a God who has become a new world of God, in accordance with the prophecy of the Apocalypse, and therefore in accordance with the final accomplished revelation. As St. Paul writes, quote, "Then comes the end, that God may be everything to everyone." First letters to Corinthians. In chapter 8 of the Red Book, The Conception of God, Jung states that before Christ could ascend into heaven, he had to descend into hell and pass through it, thus also becoming Antichrist. Quote, "No one knows what happened during the 3 days Christ was in hell. I have experienced it." End of quote. Or again, quote, "After death on the cross, Christ went into the underworld and became hell. So he took on the form of the Antichrist, the dragon, the image of the Antichrist, which has come down to us from the ancients, announces the new God." End of quote. A future figure of the Christ symbol, capable of mixing and of turning into a union or meeting of opposites, where good accepts responsibility for evil, no longer projecting it outside itself, or passing it on to others. A figure capable, therefore, of not looking for scapegoats in order to justify exclusions, humiliations, and eliminations. The First World War, in Jung's eyes, is a massive example of this eternal mechanism. Jung's intuition about the meaning of Christ's descent into the underworld is closely linked to the idea of transcending the projection of evil outside oneself and to the necessity of self-sacrifice. Quote, I saw it. I know that this is the way. I saw the death of Christ, and I saw his lament. Sanford Drob comments, quote, of Drob. Jung appears to identify the process of willing this greatest evil with your whole heart, willing this greatest evil with your whole heart. With Christ, identify this process, with Christ taking on, the sins of humanity unto himself. End of quote. Drob also cites some interesting parallels, not only with the philosophers and theologians often quoted by Jung, such as Nicholas of Győr or Meister Eckhart, but also with the Hasidic and Kabbalistic tradition, which recognizes the inherent ambivalence and co-presence of opposites in every reality, including God. It is important to note, however, that from the Red Book onwards, the role of the decisive interlocutor, which had already occurred in Jung's thought, but had become an essential element in this discussion of the crisis of civilization and the crisis of meaning that he had personally experienced, is taken from Nietzsche. Even the style of the text and the lexis are influenced by this dispute about the edge of reason, about its limits, and the chaotic imaginative turbulence that the death of God imparts to every possibility of meaning. Dante's journey through the underworld, which is certainly echoed in many passages of the Red Book, is not so strongly imbued with drama as Nietzsche's Zarathustra, for it is the latter work which marks a watershed in the history of modern European culture. In Dante, even in the underworld, we somehow know what the right way is. Nietzsche, to use an expression of Jung's, is an epoch-making case, because high and low, right and left, light and darkness merge together and are overturned, according to the announcer of the death of God in fragment 155 of the Gay Science. Since the death of God, we have returned to chaos. But the new chaos is more powerful than the original one. For it arose out of a catastrophe of every order. However, this new chaos carries, for Nietzsche, dense stars in its bosom, as Nietzsche puts it in the foreword in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote of Nietzsche, one must have chaos if one is to give birth to a dancing star. End of quote. Jung echoes this Nietzschean enantiodromia when he writes, quote, there in the world of chaos dwells eternal wonder, end of quote. But the gestation, as is evident in the history of the world and the history of 20th century thought, does not seem to have had good results, at least for the time being. So no dancing star. Well, in the Red Book, Jung notes in himself and in the experience of the Great War the immense struggle and uncertainty of the birth of a supreme meaning, a new God, a star capable of illuminating a road precisely because it was partly born out of darkness. His personal descent into chaos, a clear symbolic equivalent of the underworld, opens the door to anguish. Quote, matters are becoming serious and chaos is approaching. Is this the ultimate bottom? Is chaos also a foundation? End of quote. Philemon, too, repeats to him that chaos is, quote, without measure and utterly boundless, end of quote, and therefore beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche has said. And yet, despite this proximity, Jung finds a new path by returning to the theme of the coexistence and conjunction of opposites. Later, in 1943, perhaps in order to make the concept clearer and prevent a lapse into the complete fusion or confusion of the opposite, good and evil, Jung added that the meeting of opposites too must have its own opposite. And he found this in absolute opposition. So also the meeting and coincidence has its opposite, absolute opposition. Here we see what he had been important to Jung from the outset, accepting and confronting the challenge and torment of the shadow and of evil inside and outside the self, preventing the projection onto others of the role of the scapegoat, and hence taking the sacrifice upon oneself. The equation of the underworld with chaos is expressed in the language of the Red Book by the merging of meaning with the contradiction in terms and with nonsense. Contradiction in terms and as nonsense. But out of this abyss, the supreme meaning can arise, the conceptual correlative of the image conceived by intuition, desired by feeling, and concretized by the perceptible forms of the figure. So, correlative of the image, the supreme meaning of the God who has yet to come. The drama of the age is the collapse of the architecture, the architrave of meaning, the image concept sentiment of God. The contradiction and nonsense, which become widespread as an achievement of the artistic and philosophical avant-gardes of the 20th century, have their genealogical origin in the reference, explicit or implicit, to the order which is to be overthrown. The opening of the Red Book is a thematic enunciation and the statement of the inevitability of a clash with the messianic deposit and its drama, the way of what is to come. The introduction to the book takes the form of a dialogue between Isaiah and John about the characters of the time of the promise, from the man of sorrows to the birth of the Son, who is the Prince of Peace, and on the incarnation, the new land and its new way. In other words, it is made clear from the outset that this heritage cannot be avoided and cannot be swept aside with a declaration of death. Certainly, Nietzsche had sensed this and had foretold the idea of the earth as the adversary of, and, not of, and heir of the old God. But the Red Book is also the first clear document of Jung's criticism of the prophet of the earth. Prophet of the earth was Nietzsche in Jung's language, who had no experience of the earth, and for whom the earth remained an idea. In the chapter, The Way of the Cross, the criticism of Nietzsche is evident, and obviously later the seminar on Zarathustra. The longest book I know, the longest book about the criticism, but also the explanation of thus spoke Zarathustra. But in general, among philosophers, also my colleagues, nobody knows anything of it. Okay. Jung's biographical trajectory brings him into conflict with evanescence, the nullity of the aims which the spirit of the time offered him. Quote, "When I had the vision of the flood in October of the year 1913, it happened at a time that was significant for me as a man. At the time, in the 40th year of my life, I had achieved everything that I had wished for myself. I had achieved honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness. Then my desire for the increase of these trappings ceased. The desire ebbed from me and horror came over me." End quote. The spirit of this time is therefore a variant of the spirit which dazzles desire in many other ages. The conduct of most people, all the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, would have said his desire is oriented by the deceptive and disappointing vastness of the passions of power, wealth, and fame, the three great obstacles in the quest for wisdom. The same Jung. The temptations by the devil in the desert, which Jesus of Nazareth rejects, are ultimately also very close to these three, temptation of wealth, power, fame. We might say that in every age, in different cultural and historical forms, the spirit of the time renews its charms by inventing variations on this recurrent theme. The constant, repetitive moving of infinite desire towards the possession of finite, ephemeral objects. Bitterness, disgust, melancholy, in a word, suffering, are the symptoms which indicate that this is a road that leads nowhere. That is the wrong way, that satisfaction consumes itself and intensifies the sense of failure. A quote by Jung. I thought, Red Book, I thought and spoke much of the soul. I knew many learned words for her. I had judged her and turned her into a scientific object. The spirit of the depths contradicts the spirit of this time, for whom the soul is a thing dependent on man, which lets itself be judged and arranged, and whose circumference we can grasp. I had to accept that what I had previously called my soul was not at all my soul, but a dead system. Fear will drive him with a whip, lashing time and again in a desperate endeavor and a blind desire for the hollow things of the world. Hollow things of the world. He will run after all things and will seize hold of them, but he will not find his soul, since he would find her only in himself. Truly, his soul lies in things and men, but the blind one sees things and men, yet not his soul in things and men. He could find his soul in desire itself, but not in the object of desire. If he possessed his desire, and his desire did not possess him, he would lay a hand on his soul, since his desire is the image and expression of his soul. End of quote. Here, The Soul Without Borders, a clear quotation from Heraclitus and Infinite Desire, which is the image and expression of it, are intimately linked with each other. The image which represents the soul in the Red Book is that of the dove, a recurring theme in Jung right up to the Mysterium Connectionis of the years 1955-56, when he discusses its presence and function in alchemy. The dove appears as an illumination of the capital letter at the beginning of the first chapter of the Liber Primus, refining the soul, and the second chapter, Soul and God, together, the dove, together with the serpent. The rediscovered soul in relation to God who is to come, with the supreme meaning, has to face the serpent, its opposite. Jung provides a lengthy critique of the hasty, precarious, and perhaps false conciliation between the spirit of the air, which in Nietzsche Zarathustra becomes an eagle, and the serpent, coiled like a jeweled necklace around his neck. He does this in a discussion of the idealization and therefore in reality the negation of the tonic element of the depths, lust and the body in Nietzsche's work, providing a detailed line-by-line commentary on the text. The drama of the confrontation between opposites is resolved only in a new generation. Jung, quote, "The one eye of God is blind. The one ear of Godhead is deaf. The order of its being is crossed by chaos." If we examine these words closely, we might be dazzled by the link between the order of the divine being and the cross that crosses it, or which leads the divine being to cross chaos. The cross is therefore like chaos in the order of the supreme being. The encounter with an evil which must be acknowledged to be consubstantial with being itself, and therefore with the being of God, perhaps a way of expressing in image a different metaphysics announced by the cross of Christ itself. It is in this passion in the multiple meanings of this word, passion, that the egg of the rebirth of a new image of God is laid, the melting together of sense and non-sense, that is Jung, which produces the supreme meaning. End of quote. This is creation not only of a new form, but a different way of understanding and of relating to the real. It is a transition from substance to image, an image which is not representative, but is in itself energy and transformation, a living symbol, quote Jung. But the supreme meaning is the path, the way and the bridge of what is to come. That is the God yet to come. That is not the coming God himself, but his image, which appears in the supreme meaning. God is an image, and those who worship him must worship him in the images of the supreme meaning. End of quote. In a drawing in the Liber Secundus, the transformation of the infernal black matter, in the center of which, low down, is a magma of fire, lava erupting from a volcano, produces a serpent, out of whose mouth there emerges a tree, a sort of a tree cross. It is a variant of subforms of the iconography of the cross, similar to the cross as the tree of life. The Red Book is full of various kinds of cross. It is possibly a representation of the philosophical tree, one might also say, in view of a later version by Jung. The philosophical tree is an essay of Jung. The leaf of the tree is violet in color, a mixture of blue and red, the red of the volcanic rock and the azure of the sky, which forms a background to the treetop. The tree recurs, one of the three panels on page 63 of the Liber Secundus includes a painting of the volcanic serpent as a blue tree. The tree recurs as a blue tree similar to the tree cross of life and also to the tree of the Sephiroths. But the tree was also used to unite and separate the dove and the serpent in the illumination of the capital letter at the beginning of the second chapter of the Liber Secundus. The text, which accompanies the blue golden tree, speaks of the desire for life and the desire for a divine generation, which would be sunlight, head, and nourishment for the spirit, which would otherwise become a parasite of the body. At the bottom of the tree is a little white egg. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that it is associated with the fruit of the conjunction between the dove and the serpent, of which the tree itself has become the intermediate term through the movement of the serpent in the bowels of the volcano. The generation of the God image symbol, the result of the conjunctio between the underworld and the way of the cross, can impart to the spirit of the depths the light and heat of the living. We might also say that the parallel or manifestation of the living in the everyday life of the individual and the world is the scientific world of Jung. And this work combines the image of the magma with the ears of the conception of the Red Book. In quote, in the end, quote by Jung, but from Memories, Dreams, Reflection. In the end, this Jung, the only events in my life worth telling are those when the imperishable world erupted into this transitory one. That is why I speak chiefly of inner experiences, among which I include my dreams and visions. These form the prima materia of my scientific work. They were the fiery magma out of which the stone that had to be worked was crystallized. End of quote. And again, a passage significantly quoted on the back cover of the Red Book. Quote, it has taken me virtually 45 years to distill within the vessel of my scientific world the things I experienced, the things I experienced and wrote down at the time. As a young man, my goal had been to accomplish something in my science. But then I hit upon the stream of lava, and the heat of its fires reshaped my life. That was the primal stuff which compelled me to work upon it. And my works are a more or less successful endeavor to incorporate this incandescent matter into the contemporary picture of the world. End of quote. The work bears witness to a reciprocal fertilization of the principles which the cultural climate, even more than theological, philosophical, or scientific climate of the time, tended and still tends to make more rigid in splitting them. The processes of secularization or disenchantment of the world, no, as Weber said, or disheartening, or fetishization, as Marx said. According to the various theories that have tried to explain the loss of the regulatory importance of religion in our world, seem to be pulled by an enantiodromic rush towards the negation or marginalizing of the spiritual or integral dimension, accentuating in the extreme the parceling of lives, branches of knowledge and professions. Jung's life and work seem to form part of a movement of conscious compensation. We might say that the direction of the quest for meaning goes explicitly towards a kind of syncretism, based, as we have seen, on a revisiting of a Christian heritage and of a Western culture in general, which is the open, free horizon, free horizon within which an eclectic individual choice can be made. Syncretism and eclecticism thus form the axis between which it is possible to draw the idiosyncratic and universalistic trajectory of the process of individuation. As Jung writes in the Red Book, quote, the signposts have fallen. The signposts have fallen. Before Heidegger. It is the same in Heidegger, but Heidegger didn't know Jung. The signposts have fallen. Unblazed trails lie before us. There is only one way, and that is your way. Giving laws, wanting improvements, making things easier, has all become wrong and evil. May each one seek out his own way. The way leads to mutual love in community. Individuation leads to mutual love in community. Full stop. Men will come to see and feel the similarity and the commonality of their ways. End quote. We can therefore say that from the beginning, the idea of the process of individuation is conceived and felt as a new form of community, or rather of communion. This seems to be a different form of the utopian spirit sought out by a new way. This new form and this new way can be interpreted by reconnecting them to the figure of the Spirit in the Gospels and the Acts of Apostles. Jung. The answer from Answer to Job. The indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person in man, brings about a Christification of many. And the question arises whether these many are all complete God-men. Such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. In these circumstances, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and this split consciousness. On one side, he felt he was the apostle directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck out the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is. It is never more that his own limited ego before the one who dwells within him, whose form has no noble boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abyss of the earth and vast as the sky. And again, indicating that the age of the spirit is a possibility of liberation from the now sclerotic age of imitation, Jung, imitation was a way of life when man still needed the heroic prototype. Human epishness has lasted terribly long time, but the time will come when a piece of that epishness will fall away from man. That will be a time of salvation, and the dove, the spirit, the dove, Pentecost, and the eternal fire and redemption will descend. This is from the Red Book. The second chapter of the Act of Apostles tells of the coming down of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, the 50th day after Easter, after 7 times 7 days. The sacred numerology is only too clear in its multiplication of the days of the creation, also alluded to in a strong wind, while the fire stands for the memory and renewal of the theophany of Sinai. For Pentecost is, in Jewish history, not only a celebration of the beginning of harvest, but also a festival of the gift of the law. The new law is the spirit that is written in the hearts of humankind, and the spirit in the Protestant tradition, which forms the background of Jung cultural education. He quotes only rarely, I don't remember exactly, but I guess 1 time or 2 times Zwingli. But Zwingli is something that is obvious for in Zurich and in Switzerland. Okay, and Zwingli was, I think, the father of most of what Jung says about symbol. And because the discussion about Eucharist and so on, no? With Luther, against Luther and against Catholicism. But in any case, so the importance of Zwingli is, for me, is very great. In any case, and the spirit in the Protestant tradition, which forms the background of Jung cultural education, directly addresses the person, their individual responsibility. But the aspects of greatest proximity and interest for viewing the layers involved in the Jungian image are those of the division of the tongues of fire that separated came to rest on each of them. That is the Acts of Apostles. Man, tongues of fire that separated them and came to rest on each of them. Of language, began to speak everyone in other languages. The Spirit began to speak in other languages. And of listening, men from every nation under heaven, each one heard them speaking in his own language. So an individual inspiration, a language that expresses itself for each person according to their world and their culture. A link, therefore, between a universal spirit and an individual experience. In this sense, the Jungian prophecy of a turning towards a kind of religious psychology of the future seems to be a variation on and the development of the symbolism of Pentecost. Now I will finish in 20 seconds. We now recognize that that is Jung from the psychological types. We now recognize that the anointed of this time is a God who does not appear in the flesh. He is not man, and yet is a son of man, born in spirit and not in flesh. Hence, he can be born only through the spirit of man as the conceiving womb of the God. No, that is not, that is the Red Book. Here, the allusion to Eckhart and the birth of God is clear. But we must not forget that Jung was born in an environment deeply permeated by the theology of Zwingli, and who is indeed quoted in Psychological Types, that is, because he propounded the symbolic and memorialistic theology of the Eucharist, in contrast with the theory of the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine of Catholicism, and in another way also of Lutheranism. But the expression, the anointed of this time, and the idea of the end of the age of imitation and the heralding of a new time of the Spirit clearly allude to that current of the Christian Middle Age, which found its most complete expression in the vision and prefiguration of Joachim of Fiore. But now I have to stop. But in any case, Riccardo Bernardini will speak to you about Joachim of Fiore and the relationship between Joachim and you. Thank you.